Welcome. This is the SAB Audit Subcommittee Audit Working Group. We have a apparently full agenda today, so I think it'd be good to start with introducing ourselves and stating who we represent as a member on the subcommittee. So, Steve, would you like to start off?
Steve Inman, OPSC.
Rick Asbell, OPSC.
Jeff Becker, County School Facilities Consortium.
Shiloh Grosby, Independent Auditors.
Carolyn Baez, State Controller's Office.
Cassandra Moore Hudnall, State Controller's Office.
I'm Letty Boggs with representing CASBO.
I'm Debbie Deal from FICMAT.
Andrea Sullivan, representing CSESA, Facilities Subcommittee of County Offices.
Bill Savage, Assistant Executive Officer for the State Allocation Board.
Arlene Motzura, California Department of Education.
Lady, before we go further, I want to, Cassandra informed me that this is her last meeting with us, and I just wanted to recognize the amazing service that she's given the committee and me over time in being a supportive person and a resource and just a very solid person to have on this group, and I really thank you for the time you've served here. And I think she's going to be promoted, so she'll be in charge of everything from now on, as far as I can tell. So thank you so much, Cassandra, for your help. And maybe you can introduce your...
Certainly. Thank you so much for the kind words. I really enjoyed working with the committee, learned a lot, so I appreciate the opportunity. This is Carolyn Baez. She will be the acting Bureau Chief with the Financial Audits Bureau, so we brought her here so she can get familiar with the whole process and what's going on.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could we have a couple, everybody have an agenda that needs one? I think we need 2 more agendas up here if there are any out there.
Are there any more back there?
3, make that 3. Thank you. Well, we got some feedback from our listening audience out there on the web. I know those of us who represent school districts did. So as we're in our discussions today, I think there are a couple of things that we really want to keep in mind for them. And one of them is to keep this from getting more complex than it needs to be, which is always a good goal and always a challenge. And we heard that in several ways from folks, so we will be watching for that. And also a concern with duplicative processes. Part of what raised the hue and cry to start with was that we felt like we were being re-audited on things we're already audited on. And so we want to be sure that we're not making processes that require us then to go through multiple audits as school districts on the very same information. So here's our effort to try and get this coordinated and efficient, and let's take another run at it. Bill?
Good. Thank you, Letty. And I think that I hope we are coming to a scenario in terms of sort of a conceptual approach to how we want to handle this that I do think is going to represent some consolidation and streamlining of procedures and earlier reviews that are in keeping with what the Audit Working Group came up with in the first round of recommendations. And I do think the other piece that I heard loud and clear in terms of feedback that I got was to ensure that we were, whenever possible, using existing resources that or audits that districts are already going through as a vehicle that could provide accountability for school facilities programs, but not that they were added on as an additional step, but that they could be a parallel track that could be provided for districts. So I definitely heard that loud and clear in terms of some of the feedback that I got also. So before we get into the meat of the discussion, one of the things for us to think about is what other meetings we might need as a working group, and when do we think it would make sense for us to try and report back to the audit subcommittee to make sure that they are okay with where the direction that we're going with in terms of what is the approach. And then at the very bottom of the agenda, I put, some thought for the next meeting about how we want to treat the recommendations. There was a body of original recommendations that was approved by the audit working group. Forwarded to the subcommittee, approved by the subcommittee, approved by the board. How do we want to modify or change those? And so I just tossed that out as something to think about at the very end, but always trying to think about the end in mind as we go forward. So 2 things to think about: how many more times do we need to get together as a working group? How close are we with something that everyone feels comfortable with? And secondly, then sort of how we think about modifying the recommendations that were previously brought forward. So any comments on that? Or good. Okay, so we want to look at essentially the conceptual workflow diagram, which is the colored sheet, and I'm going to have Mr. Asbell do the basic presentation. What we tried to do is take off from what we heard last time and actually through feedback that we all got from various sources. And so I've asked Rick to, one of the key elements, just to start out, is one of the key areas that we had discussed last time was how do you put together the earliest possible review of compliance certifications and coordinate that with the other reviews so that we streamline the upfront process, get everything reviewed and taken care of as early as possible. And so Rick is going to present that first consolidated review approach as the first step in this process.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. So we've got some light now. Actually, dovetailing on what Letty had talked about, being less complex and no duplication, I think with the workflow that you have in front of you right now does kind of streamline things where we're actually trying to consolidate checks occurring at one central point, which would be at the 18 months. So if I could step you through this going from left to right. One of the things that we will continue to do once somebody comes in with a fund release is we will continue to verify construction contracts and LCP compliance at that time. We know that's a hot button issue. We'll continue to take a look at that. So that's early on in the process. The change that we're looking at now, though, under this process is at 18 months, what we would do is we would consolidate the appropriate 5004 certifications, 5005, and substantial progress all into one check. The other thing is we're looking at eliminating the first 5006 being due 1 year after the fund release and actually pushing it to the 18 months so everything can be done at one time. That way districts aren't having to report their 5006 at 12 months and then also worry about a check at 18 months. Basically, if we can just put it all in one step, I think that would streamline the process.
So let me make at our last meeting, what I recall is that we had a discussion about this timeline, whether to go with 12 months, whether to go with 18. I think that what we're recommending, based upon issues related to the progress of the project, that 18 months is probably a better milestone. The 18-month substantial progress submittal exists already in regulation for the program. The 12-month submittal of the 5006 could be moved to coordinate with that, and then the new step that's combined there is that this is the point at which certifications made in either the 5004 or the 5005 could be checked at what looks like the earliest possible place. So, Rick, why don't we just take a second and do people want to think about this one or comment a little bit about this and whether we've ended up in the right area or not?
I think the motivation for the 12-month timeline, if I recall correctly, was that we didn't want a long span of time before things were found that would trigger a material inaccuracy conversation. So obviously this is still way better than 4 to 8 years that we're kind of seeing problems occur now.
Well, okay, so I think some of the issues that I raised the last time we discussed the 12-month model was that if you're looking at 12 months from the fund release, you have to kind of back into that 12 months in which we could do the verification by then. We would probably need the information a couple months prior to that. So now, instead of 12 months, people would have to get the information to us within 10 months. And then we would have to have time after that to be able to check it. So that does put a little bit of a time constraint on the districts to be able to get that information to us a lot quicker than the 1 year. I mean, you're having to accelerate that. So that was one of the concerns that I had. It gives them a little bit more time if you go with the 18 months and consolidate everything.
I'm not quite understanding, though, what you mean by 12 becomes 9 or 10. So are you saying that, I mean, I'm just, does 18 become 16 or 15 months? Is that what you're saying?
Are you saying that if it has, that it triggers at 18 months, or it has to be completed within 18 months?
I thought we were looking at it would have to be done at the 12 months. That's
Okay,
what I had
yeah.
heard. So in order to do that, then you have to back into that with information coming to us. We've got to be able to ask for the information, because we're not going to ask for information related to all the certifications. So we would send out a doc request letter. We'd give the districts ample time to be able to get that information to us, and then we would look at it and verify it. But now you've got to start backing into that 12 months. You've got to start chopping into that timeline. So that's one of the concerns.
That actually makes the 18 months make sense, if that's the completion target, not the
Yes.
start.
And I do think the flip side of it, just as a guy who used to be a construction guy for schools, the 18-month substantial progress piece for many projects, not all obviously, but you get to a point in construction where you do have substantial progress. You want to be able to meet those milestones. So moving that around or moving that closer, that was an alternative. If we tried to move everything to 12 months, then all of a sudden you're kind of artificially collapsing the sort of milestone that's really related to the progress of the project.
And I think there were some issues also with trying to meet the 18-month substantial progress. There's actually, you can actually do a one-time request to ask for an extension. So that kind of goes back to people not being able to get the information to us maybe in a timely manner. So we want to give them as much time as possible. I think 12 months might be cutting a little bit too close. Okay, so any questions on that?
Questions on that?
Everybody's more or less okay with that as a concept. So I like this. I think it creates a single consolidated milestone for accountability. Tell me about, Rick, just to go into some of these just for a second. You've got a list, a fairly lengthy list of 5004, 5005s with, did I see 80 certifications, or was that just?
I think it's 60 or close to 60.
Sorry.
I think we did give you a 5004 and a 5005 that kind of has numbers written on it, and that cross-references to the matrix I think that you're referring to.
So could you go over the matrix a little bit and just sort of, so how does the matrix read and how does it work in terms of this new milestone?
Okay, so if you're looking at the matrix, let's just take a look at the first one, for example.
That's this one right here. Yeah, you've got these.
Is everybody well on the same page? Okay. So district rep is authorized rep. That is a certification. Based on the proposed flow chart that we're looking at here, we're looking at 3 checkpoints essentially. Time of fund release, and the reason why we put time of fund release there is we're still looking at contracts and we're still looking at LCP issues. So we want to call that out. The incremental or the consolidated incremental check happens at the 18 months. So that's your center column there in purple. And then the closeout. There are going to be some things that we cannot verify at the consolidated incremental compliance check. Just because the project maybe hasn't matured, maybe there's some things that needs to be kind of closed up on the back end. Let me get an example for you. Number 9, let's go down to number 9. It says all contracts after 11/4/98 were competitively bid. Well, we could look at that at the 18 months, but there could be other contracts that are let after that. And so we really wouldn't know about those contracts until we actually got to the closeout. So that's why you see the 2 X's that are occurring there.
But you would have to have the major construction and architectural contracts, which are the big bucks.
And that's for
Would
your
be
fund
able to be
release.
early.
Yes, yes. But if you take the certification on face value, it says all contracts. So that's a situation where you would not be able to check it in those first 2 phases, the time of fund release or the consolidated. So what we've tried to do, as best we can, based on all the certifications on the 5004 and the 5005, where we think that check would occur based on what that certification is. That's what this matrix represents. We also get into substantial progress, which is down there, line 61, line 62. Of course, nothing can happen prior to the substantial progress because that's the process. That is the substantial progress. And nothing would occur after that because that's where we're doing the check for those particular items. So that's the gist of this. A lot of certifications.
So let's remind ourselves of the discussion from last time, and it is a lot of certifications. How would you select, or what's the process in a typical situation like this? If you have, you're not going to, I would assume that you wouldn't ask for certification and documentation on all 69, 70, whatever it is, certifications. Are there certifications that have greater priority? I would assume so. How do you define those? What's the process of making this a manageable number?
So we would not look at every certification. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. We don't have the staffing to do that. That would be very burdensome to the district to be able to give us information on each one of those certifications. We couldn't verify things in a timely manner. There are things such as the issues with the fund release, the contracts, and the LCP. We know those are hot button issues. There have been material inaccuracies associated with that. That's where we would really focus. Those would be basically the two that we would look at for those situations. As time goes on, if we're starting to see a trend or issues that are being brought forward, we're having findings, things are going to the board that are related to certain certifications, we'll have a tendency to focus on that. That's kind of the risk assessment that you would use to take a look at that. So I wouldn't say it's cookie cutter because it's really dynamic and it could change. But I will tell you that we will not look at every single certification. There's just no way we could do that.
And not all apply to every project anyway.
That's correct, yes.
That's a good point, actually. Okay.
Okay, so does anybody else have any questions in this green area? Okay, so if we move over to the next part, so something was brought up by one of our members here last month about, well, do we look at the 5006 reports? And as a reminder, 1 year or on a yearly basis after your fund release, you're supposed to submit your 5006 report. And one of the questions was, do we look at those? And my response to that was, just based on the number of 5006s that would come in, we don't have the staffing to take a look at that. So I think somebody brought forth the idea, well, what if as the 5006s come in, there's a trigger to where maybe there's another entity that takes a look at the 5006. That way we can catch issues earlier on. The scope of that, I think, is to be determined, but some of the things that I heard was that we're looking at internal controls and maybe doing a random sampling of some of the expenditures on the 5006. So based off of that comment, what we did was we looked at, you got dashed lines that are coming down from the 4th blue box and the 5th blue box down to this external audit entity here. Once again, what they would look at would be subject to any kind of audit guide or regulations that would have to be vetted and so forth. And then it's my understanding, once it goes down this path, it's kind of a parallel track to what we do. It's kind of going into the K-12 Education Audit Appeals Panel type process. So does anybody have any questions about that? Now, one of the things with this also is what I heard was every 5006 up until you get to the closeout or the final 5006 could trigger this external entity looking at this. So that was what I heard. Does everybody agree with that concept? Or
Go ahead, Jeff.
I have some questions about this and trying to reconcile it with the past discussions, and some of it maybe would be better addressed by people here that do external audits through the education appeals process. If the 18-month 5006 triggers the external audit as a part of the audit guide, is that not an annual audit? And then aren't we auditing a scope outside of the 12 months being audited, the fiscal year being audited? One question, that was one question. The other I had is this external auditor looking at the 5006 itself, or are they looking and sampling from expenditures in Fund 35? that seems to me to be two very different things, and
Have
the
our
timing of
experts,
those
weigh
comes
in
at
on that
different
one.
times.
Right. Let me add some questions to that conversation, because this is probably the area that I got the most feedback on. This happens anyway. I think at least what I had in my head was that we would notify our auditors that we were using facility funds and to include them in the normal process of their routine audit, which would mean that they would include Fund 35 and whatever matching funds. You might have a 21 or 40 that you're using. So if your auditor would be aware that your capital facility funds were in play. And so they would be included in the scope of your normal audit, which would only involve an extra CDE process or a hearing process. If your normal audit came up with issues, then it would follow the same process. But it's not an expanded role of that audit. It is the normal fiscal audit because they look at all the right things with respect to that anyway. So I think that's part of the question I have. Or do I not have that right? And ditto on Jeff's question.
Well, just to briefly answer what you're looking at, I think I understand what you're saying a little bit, Letty, in it being part of the normal audit, but it's not really part of the normal audit because it would be added to the audit guide. We'd have to be provided the guidance to tell us what we're looking at. And
what would you look at differently than you look at now? Because we're asking you to look
Well, we'd be looking at it from the standpoint of compliance versus...
No, not compliance. So if you weren't looking at compliance, you're looking at, did we spend the money per public contract code? Was there any fraud? Did we have internal controls in place? Are the expenditures appropriate to the
You
fund?
want to jump in, Cassandra?
Okay, so part of that would be compliance. So if they're looking at it for public contract code compliance.
Which applies to all school district expenditures.
Right, but that doesn't mean that they currently are being looked at. And I think the thing is that, in thinking this through, I would think that in the audit guide, the K-12 audit guide, there'd probably be, there'd be a specific section like there had been in the past, saying that you're going to, if the district has some 5006 or, has capital facilities and you're going to pull one of the 5006s, randomly, and you're going to sample some expenditures.
So if I was building a district-funded facility using Fund 21 and no OPC involvement, that is audited now through my regular audit process. How does this differ?
That's actually audited through the Prop 39 legislation audits. Now, from a financial standpoint, from a financial standpoint, there is an audit of the fund and the financial activity. So I think what we're talking the difference between what is the scope of the audit, what's the objective. Is the scope of the audit to determine that the financial statements related and the expenditures reported on the district's books related to capital projects, are those expenditures fairly stated? That's a financial audit. Are the expenditures fairly stated? That's all we would be opining on in relation to looking at the expenditures in a regular financial audit. Right. Now, I'm imagining that what OPSC and what everyone's looking for is beyond a little bit more than that. I'm imagining that they're looking for us to tell them that these expenditures meet certain requirements, meaning they are within the scope of the fund release that they were issued for, so that they meet the guidelines of the application, and therefore it becomes more of, are they in compliance with the regulations that the district was granted the monies for. And so it is a little different. So if you're talking about financial statement material expenditures, that's part of the financial audit, and that does factor in internal controls. But I believe this goes a little beyond that in scope, and that's why I say you have to define what that scope is before you can say it's already truly included in the audit. I do want to address your questions a little bit because I think it does point out a couple of the concerns I had from last time, and I know we had a lot of pushback on that. I, right off the bat, could see from an external audit standpoint, if the 5006 becomes part of the audit, I don't really see it being a difficult process to incorporate a Fund 35 expenditure audit within the audit guide. Where I envision some timing issues would be that when that 5006 is prepared in conjunction with the fiscal year. I do see an issue with that, because if I'm being told to audit the 5006, well, I want to audit the 5006 related to a fiscal year. That I'm an auditor. That's kind of my mindset. And I know we already heard that a 5006 aligning with a district's fiscal year end is a cumbersome task because they're already doing a lot of things at June 30th. And so we'd have to figure out how that works, because we would essentially be auditing expenditures on a 5006 that are not part of the fiscal year we're auditing, and I would see some issues with that.
We do have experience with items not being aligned because we deal with the SARC, and that doesn't align with the fiscal year. So I don't think those are things that are burdensome. You just have to have, you have to figure out the right technique.
They're all in Excel. You can do an annual sort of the worksheet, although our particular worksheet is a series of worksheets, which is a cumbersome but doable. It's
right. And then,
of course, 15 minutes.
Of course, we would be looking back in that environment. We'd be looking back to ensure that it does tie back into the fund, the financial statements, the general ledger of the district, and so that's making sure all of it ties in to be able to validate the 5006 that is being audited and that it agrees to the GL would be part of that audit, I would imagine.
So let me kind of recap, make sure I've got this. And I take issue with you on the Prop 39. It is not an expenditure audit.
No, it's not.
So
it is a compliance audit. The Prop 39 is a compliance audit.
It has a really different, it's accomplishing something different than what a fiscal audit does.
Yes, I agree.
So you have your Prop 39 audit. Then you have the fiscal audit that looks at our expenditures fairly stated. It also does some checks on internal controls and fraud, and that's a normal part of the audit. Then there is the element of requirements of the program, and that's the piece we have to put in this process at the most logical and efficient place. That's really the question that we're dealing with, because we already have the other audits. So on the one hand, we're kind of trying to protect that we don't reduplicate what we're already doing in the audits, but at the same time, we want to make sure we're doing compliance appropriate to the program, and that's really the issue at question. Does that need to happen at OPSC, an external entity, or some other manner? That kind of
good.
Summarize it?
Yeah, that's good. I have a couple things real quickly. I know you guys are the experts, but my understanding of what is being proposed here is not that districts would have both OPSC doing expenditure reviews and an external auditor, but one or the other.
Yes.
There would be, in other words, this is not an additional step on top of, in other words, so if someone goes through the path of the external audit, they stay in that pathway and go on, unless the issue is what happens if there's a major finding, other concerns, and we'll get to some of that discussion in a sec. So is that everyone? Is that?
I just also wanted to clarify, when we're talking this calendar, we're talking regular non-financial hardship, but at some point we ought to get back to talking financial hardship and that calendar overlay. So we just need to do that at some point.
So just a point of clarification. So we're talking about the 5006. I think what we had envisioned was that the checks the external entity would do would be for all the 5006 prior to the final closeout. That was kind of my understanding.
So,
And what would be different at that point then? Does that mean that you would go back over all of the things that have already been audited? Let's just say that it goes to an external audit. And let's just say that we put in those pieces like any other categorical program would have, its own requirements and whatnot. Are you saying then at the end of this process that OPSC would redo all of that work?
I think we would leverage what had already been done, and then for that final report, because there'll be a year difference between your next to last report and your final report. So we would probably take a look at that last year's entry, and then we would leverage what had already been done. We wouldn't duplicate.
conjunction with the annual audit? Because, I mean,
Yeah.
once it goes to an external path, it
Right.
goes all the way to the end, right?
yeah.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I
That
understand.
was my understanding.
So, okay, but let me just try and understand that. So if what you're saying is it goes down on the track and then it jumps back over for some kind of final certification?
Well, it would be the closeout. So I think
what percentage of projects do you do a 5006 final closeout on right now?
well, we have to close out projects. We have to close them all out. Now, what we look at and how we do that verification, that goes from project to project. But every project has to be closed out one way or another, whether they're financial hardship, non-financial hardship.
So it's really,
there has to be some kind of closure.
It's
somewhere.
almost for a project that has no problems, no issues, all the expenditures are allowable, everything's fine. What do you do?
So let me throw out a scenario. Let's say you have a modernization project that's overspent, that's non-financial hardship. That's one in which we could just administratively close out during our closeout process. But let's say you had a project that had financial hardship that had savings or some kind of line item adjustment that had to occur. We have to take that to the board to be able to close that out through the board's actions.
And sorry, let me just finish one train of thought. So I guess what I was seeing is in the two parallel tracks that there in fact might be a subset of projects where that would stay in an OPSC review track, especially if those projects had financial adjustments that had to be taken back to the state allocation board. So
the way the program is set up right now, the regulation, the statute, you have to take anything for an adjustment back to the state allocation board for approval. That's the framework right now.
Okay.
Okay, so I have a thought, but I want to welcome Kathy Allen to the dais. She's representing CASH, correct? Okay. Glad you could join us. There are a significant body of projects where if the architectural contract, the land value, and the construction contract were considered, those three contracts added together constitute the amount of the state grant with the match. So in those cases, you can tell very early on that the district has met. I mean, anything that got disqualified would be irrelevant at the end because you had met your match through three verified contracts, or land may be more than one contract, I realize. You may be putting together multiple parcels. But I know that works because with our clients, we work with them that you can always do your matching transfers out of just those three object codes for the whole project, and that works in most cases. So there may be a protocol that can be developed that identifies projects that are highly unlikely to have things that you have to go through and say this didn't qualify, that didn't qualify, because all the district does in the current mechanism is said, okay, and that increases our savings and we're fine. It's a paper chase to some extent because you're really working with the district's extra contribution above what the state pays and what has to be matched. So there may be instances where there are protocols that identify a low-risk project from the state's match perspective and can be easily identified with those very solid major contracts. And I think that might be worth a look at. A way to simplify that process.
I think we discussed this concept last month. Remember, this is a matching program, so
that's right.
Just to take care of the state's part of it is only part of the equation. You got to make sure that the district's part is also taken care of.
Yeah,
that's
exactly
the premise behind the match.
The state's part and its match in lots of projects is met by those three items, those three object codes. So everything else that you would bother to look at really is irrelevant because if you disqualify it, it becomes district savings.
Okay, so
it's a mathematical.
Well, let's back up for a second. So when you say state share and its match, you talking about the district's match?
Because the project value from the state's perspective, the 100% that the state's looking at, state and district match,
together
is really only 60 or 70% of the project value.
Yeah, hard construction
in those
costs.
cases.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there could be some projects that are routed based on certain parameters and criteria, assuming that you take into account the district and the state share, where things can kind of be covered, yeah.
And it doesn't mean they don't need to be appropriately accounted for and public contract code and all those things validated, but the reality is that it is a grant program, and if the district adds money to the project, they have district discretion in those expenditures.
For me, this is where it gets complicated and maybe more complicated than it needs to be. When I think about these two tracks, when we start talking about looking at various criteria and then some go on a different track than others, I think that is not in line with what the original recommendations were of this group, and is making this process more complicated and probably would not be viewed favorably by a lot of different entities. When I see these two tracks, what I envision in my mind, this is how I envision the process to go, is that every year, as a part of our annual audit, if there are capital project expenditures, they're looked at for program compliance and internal controls and compliance with public contract code and all that good stuff by the external auditor. As 5006s roll into OPSC, they're doing a simple mathematical review of that at that point, because compliance of those expenditures has already been determined through a sampling by our external auditors. And then at the end of the project for closeout, there is a basic reconciliation of the funding shell to the final 5006, and any adjustments are made at the allocation board that need to be made. It's not a matter of going back in and then zeroing in on additional expenditures at that point, because they've already been audited by the external auditor. So for me, it's a much simpler process. In terms of their appropriateness and how they were made, compliance with code and bid requirements, et cetera, as well as compliance with the program rules, because we would have to define that for our external auditors. So for me, it gets really sideways when we start talking about some staying on different tracks than others.
Okay. Fair comment.
Absolutely fair comment.
Just from a perspective of receiving all the school district reports, we rarely see a finding regarding public contract code, any type of findings with respect to the expenditures. Primarily because, I think it's maybe two reasons. One, the auditors are not necessarily doing it. It depends on the firm and what you contract with that firm. And two, they can determine that it's not material. If you want the external audit, the annual audit, to mean something to OPSC, it's important that you put it in the audit guide, and they test expenditures in accordance with whatever the regulations are. So, and then there'll be a report back in state compliance stating that they tested these expenditures and they either have no findings or they have findings and they're reported. So,
I would have to echo what Cassandra says and agree completely that there's a lot that goes on in the financial audit, and so and when I was commenting on the scope of the audit and the objective of the audit earlier, Letty, that's really exactly what I was referring to. Is you're not guaranteed that these are going to be looked at in the regular financial audit, and that's why having the very specific procedures in terms of what OPSC wants is critical. And it could even be to the level of saying you must look at public contract code requirements for expenditure, for any expenditures in Fund 35. The one concern I would have is, if the auditors take on that role of auditing the Fund 35 expenditures or the capital project expenditures on an annual basis, what will happen with the 5006 with OPSC at the end? You definitely, and I think that's where we don't want to get to, there being an additional expenditure audit that would occur at that closeout phase. And so if you're incorporating an element in the audit guide of tying out, the expenditures for the annual year to the 5006, I think it covers that. And there wouldn't be a need for there to be that additional process at the end.
Well, and before Rick jumps in, I know he's going to, but I think the word that Jeff used, which I liked, was reconciliation. Yes. I mean, Rick, does that make sense from your standpoint?
Yeah, I think so.
I think when you're putting in the audit guide standards, just like some of the other special funds that school districts are given, like instructional materials, let's say, that they have a very specific purpose, that the expenditures are validated to that particular program, and the sampling then would probably be, I would think that there would be some thresholds in there of sampling that OPSC would want to have in the audit guide, so that, just like when we're talking about federal programs, there's thresholds in there, and so that a particular percentage of expenditures would be tested and matched against those criteria that OPSC establishes. Then I totally agree with, what's been said here. At that point, we're done. And then it's just a mathematical reconciliation at the end, or over, under, savings, go to the board, whatever. But the test of the expenditures, and that's where we're going to need OPSC's input to say, okay, what does that need to look like for the external auditors to ensure that they're meeting the expectations that OPSC has at the end of the day, so that we don't have to worry about having these two parallel tracks of, audit on top of audit. We don't want to have that duplication for school districts, for sure.
Okay, so maybe so I can understand this and make sure I'm on the same page here. Remember I talked about, if you're looking at 5006s on a yearly basis, the external entity, and they can check off on those expenditures listed on those 5006s. There are still expenditures that are going to occur after the last 5006 the external entity looks at. So we may have to jump in and take a look at that last expenditure report for kind of the final resolution. But we would leverage, based on what we'd seen on the previous work by the external entity, to see if there were any issues, and then go from there. We would not go over what had already been done, is what I'm trying to say.
Why would that be? So let's just say that we get into an audit period and we're 3 months past the end of the fiscal year, and you're going to close out. Why do you believe that at that point OPSC has to get involved in the 5006 when part of that very next audit year is going to be included?
I was going to suggest.
I'm trying to understand that.
Well, I was going to suggest that there could be to ensure if there's final expenditures in the next fiscal year that year is audited as well. Mm-hmm. So if the auditor is accounting for all the way up through the very last 5006 that's issued, then there wouldn't be additional expenditures beyond that.
Where I'm getting confused here is who would look at the final 5006?
I think it goes all the way. I think the stream goes all the way from to the end.
So what I would
let's make sure. Sorry, just hold that thought, because there are the state allocation board has to approve a certain subset of reconciliations.
Right.
I mean, the staff can take administrative action to close out projects. That's fine, and they sounds like they need to do that too. It sounds, but the board has to take action on a number of projects. So it sounds to me like instead of parallel tracks, we have a single track that then some portion of the projects do need to go back. It sounds. I heard Rick say that they need to close out from an administrative standpoint and a paperwork standpoint every project, and I heard that some subset has to go back and be approved after its reconciliation to the state allocation board. Did you
just some ideas, okay? I think part of the reason we're having an issue with this is that auditors work on fiscal year, school districts live on fiscal year, and OPSC lives on anniversary date, SAB anniversary date. It is possible to change that. If we're going to be audited by fiscal auditors, we could say, you have your SAB anniversary date, but upon the first close of that first fiscal year, after you've gotten SAB funding, your 5006 is due within your closing window. We were kind of hoping not to add this to the burden of closing. Just the idea may not be workable at all, but a district may be able to set a date, and that's the date that fiscal auditor reviews up to that date every year, the 5006 that was issued during that year, and the fiscal part isn't through until the final audit's been done. Then the paperwork goes to OPSC. So maybe that that closeout window looks different. You know, because we've talked about it,
Right.
that a lot of them set at 98 and 99 for a little while. And we'd like to have a year, because until you've lived a year in a building, you don't know if you've really done all the F&E. And that, you know, that's legitimate. So there is kind of a tailing end on those projects that may be able to give us that window to square it up.
To avoid having to change that fiscal year, because what we had heard was that would be difficult for many districts.
Yeah.
You know, from an auditor standpoint, what I would envision is, as long as there's expenditures in those funds, we would be auditing it. And so that would take you all the way through the depletion, the complete depletion of those funds, which would mean, let's just say the very last expenditure occurred in the beginning of the fiscal year. Well, we would still audit for that fiscal year expenditures, even though it was, let's just say, in July, which would be the first month of the fiscal year. We would audit that because you had expenditures in that fiscal year. So that would include auditing the expenditures all the way up through the very final 5006. What you could also do to alleviate any issues with the reconciliation of the 5006 at the very final project closeout is ask for an audit procedure in the audit guide that says, in the final closeout, make sure that the expenditures reconcile to the financial records for the whole project. And then
transfer something like that back to OPSC.
Right, and then in that would be the final year, and then OPSC could place some reliance that that final 5006 at least reconciles to the financial records, and then they can proceed with the closeout and whatever other process that they have. That would not have to include another expenditure review, because they could have some assurance that the expenditures have been audited through the completion of the project.
Well, there's a one-to-one reconciliation of the funds within 35. There's not a one-to-one reconciliation with the 5006 and the match for that 5006. So I think it's hard to do it on a per fund basis other than Fund 35. You could say everything contained in Fund 35 is on some form of 5006. That you could verify and reconcile, but within the district's funds, that's part of the big challenge, is every single funding source has different requirements, different exercise. So just that works, but it only works for Fund 35. And it wouldn't be the whole 5006.
We're talking about we're really talking about closeout here, and we've got a track that we seem comfortable with in terms of thinking about the external audit function, and obviously lots of issues to iron out about the input of OPSC into the scope and the coordination of the fiscal year stuff. But the discussion in the last few minutes has gone around about how do we get to the end, how do we meet the needs that OPSC has in terms of their requirement under the law to staff the board and to do the reconciliation process and take some of this back to the board. How do we avoid having a duplicative process even at the end if we can do it? So, you know, this is a hard area. All I was trying to do is try to get my head around it, because it's a difficult area. There's some real needs that OPSC has and that the State Allocation Board has, and there's real needs for us to avoid creating duplicative processes. So anyway, let's keep working on it. Can I do one thing? And are there any members of the audience or anyone here that would like to make a comment or ask a question? So please let us know at any point if you do, okay? Thanks.
I think we're just making their heads hurt.
Can I ask one? This is going to go backwards, but I just want to ask it anyway. I think I feel comfortable with the annual audit approach that we're talking about. I think it makes sense in terms of a lot of what is being discussed. But we did very quickly put aside the use of Prop 39 audits as a vehicle for this approach. Can we just go back and make sure that that makes sense and that we have good reasons for doing that? And I say that because I did get some feedback from people about that issue. And one of the things that we're trying to accomplish, which we would accomplish either way, is we recognize that school districts are audited on a number of different levels when they have these types of funds and types of programs and projects they participate in. Prop 39 bonds require a financial audit and a performance audit. Remind me again why we ended up on the annual audit approach as opposed to using the Prop 39 vehicle. And I know some of the answers, but I just want to make sure we go. And I know this is going back. I apologize. But let's just look at it one more time. Kathy?
I just want to add another little comment because recently CalBOC, California Bond Association or Bond Oversight Committees, has come out with, and it may not be recent, a very long document of recommendations. Some of them are Ed Code, some of them are from San Diego County Taxpayer Association, and some are from CalBOC. One of them is they want Prop 39 audits done by an auditor different from the district's audit. So talk about duplicative there, but I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, that some of us are going to be having to deal with that are the auditing firm that's performing Prop 39 audits in some cases might be completely separate from the district's auditor.
Hello?
I don't know why we got away from that approach, because quite honestly, I think from the audit perspective, we prefer that approach. I think the biggest challenge with that approach is ensuring that whatever legislation is created to request that has enough clarity that we understand what is being asked. We did have a lot of difficulties early on with Prop 39 in understanding what exactly was the definition of a performance audit, and you saw performance audits of all different types across the board.
You did.
And it wasn't until the cleanup language required a yellow book audit that changed that and gave us a little more clarity regarding what we needed to do. So if we go down that path, which, like I said, I think from an external audit perspective, we like, because then that gives a little bit more clarity regarding the report is being issued as a separate report, as well as the funding source available to pay for that audit. When it becomes part of the audit guide, most of the times the additional time required for that is just absorbed by the auditors. And that's just the reality. It gets absorbed by the auditors in many cases just because of the economic times that districts are in. Now, we obviously have the opportunity to tell the clients you need to do this and that we're going to be charging for that. And that's neither here nor there, irrelevant to the case. The work needs to be done. But the clarity of what needs to be audited would be the key in going about it in this Proposition 39 type of format, and defining the exact scope of that audit, I think, would be the biggest challenge. And that's what I know auditors would be looking for, understanding what exactly do you want.
Okay.
So.
In terms of Prop 39, there's no oversight by any state agency. So you're going to have, your audits will be only as good as the understanding of the auditor. It would be up to OPSC to gather every Prop 39 audit, so it's going to add more burden to the OPSC staff. At this point, if you put the expenditure audit in the audit guide, there's already an infrastructure, so to speak, that OPSC can leverage in order to do their work and to do their follow-up. So, and the Prop 39 audits are typically like agreed upon procedures. So basically, though the coverage is defined, the audit coverage is pretty much defined by the district as well as the auditor versus an oversight group. So,
there's
and they vary wide.
I was going to say there's a wide range in between those two ends. There's some that just do a minimal amount, just the bare amount to get by. And then there are those boards that want a more involved audit, and, but it's up to the districts. Each individual district can decide what that range is going to be. And that's going to be really risky at that point if you're going to attach this kind of auditing feature to it. It's going to take additional legislation for sure.
Yeah, and that's why I emphasize the clarity in what is being asked for. Definitely.
Arlene?
I think we talked about this briefly last time, but one of the things about putting it in the annual audit guide is the cost of the audit is paid for by the districts. In the past, the audits have been performed by OPSC, which in the state picked it up. But it's just a comment that it is changing.
Thank you. I didn't mean to take us back on the track. I just wanted to make sure we had a clear understanding that I think we have an approach that everyone has been talking about that would use the annual education audit, and I didn't mean to cut you off.
And I would just add that not everybody has a Prop 39.
There you go. That's another good reason. Yeah. So can we struggle with the closeout phase just for a little bit longer? Sorry. I mean, I think it would be, what are recognizing the differing needs of the existing state agency and trying not to be duplicative, what's the best way to end up in the closeout if we were to use an annual education audit as an external audit vehicle, recognizing that we need some reconciliation and some action by the state allocation board on some of the projects? What's an outline that would make that work? Don't all jump in at once either. No, that's fine. Rick?
Well, I think the first step would be, at a minimum, you'd have to find out or define which projects actually would have to go back to the state allocation board, the way things are structured right now. And so kind of what I relayed to you earlier, if you have a project that has either an increase or a decrease in some kind of funding as it relates to the project, whether it's financial hardship or non-financial hardship, if you have to do an adjustment, it has to go to the board.
Can you give me an idea of what subset of programs under the school facility program require an adjustment or don't allow savings or something like that?
In terms of, let's see, I believe facility hardship, I don't think you can have savings on that. Career tech, I don't think you can have savings on that. So there are a couple projects out there, or a couple programs in which that occurs. Kind of going back to the line items that I was talking about, anything when you have site, DTSC, relocation assistance, toxic, those kinds of things, depending on what you were given as far as the grant, if there's any kind of a variance between that and what you spent, then that would have to be taken to the board also.
Both, and sometimes that variance can be that the district comes forward with additional costs.
Yes, it can be an increase.
So they can get a grant increase.
That's correct, yes, yes. So, yeah, it does swing both ways.
That's site acquisition?
Site acquisition, and then under that you would have your DTSC, relocation assistance, did I say toxics? And I think that might be it.
And that all typically happens early on in a project.
Not necessarily. I mean, normally for site acquisition, yes.
Unless you're in eminent domain, that's right.
Right.
Then you can take it and still be closing.
But think about once you start construction and maybe you run across some asbestos issues or something like that, and now you're incurring additional costs because of that. That very well could lead to an adjustment also, and that may happen later on in the process. You may not be able to catch it on the front end.
And then there is just the administrative process of closeout lets a district know that they're done. I know districts go look for that closeout on the website that they're closed, and then
yeah, we do that, and we've also instituted that we notify when we do a closeout, whether it's through a board action or just administrative, that we also send you a closeout letter on that too.
Okay. A question and a comment, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it a little bit because I don't fully understand the background with all of the construction and OPSC funding and programs. Realizing that there are a lot of different programs and a lot of different requirements that you need to look at the final 5006 and project closeout element of what you guys do. If the auditor is simply looking at the 5006 in relation to expenditures, and that's all we're doing, is what I'm imagining, so correct me if I'm wrong on that, then anything else that OPSC would need to do to close it out would not be duplicate. That would just be, I mean, no matter what type of project it is, it would, you might have different things you have to look at for different types of projects. So I don't see an issue, and I don't see any overlap. If the auditor is solely looking at expenditures, I don't see that there's an overlap. What I don't understand how it plays into that is when you talk about adjustments. Does that affect what an auditor would do from an expenditure compliance testing standpoint in your closeout process? Because otherwise, to me, it's very simple. We're looking at expenditures and they're looking at other things, so I don't see that there's a lot of issues with this.
Another way to say that would be that OPSC doesn't need to retest expenditures on the 5006. They simply rely on the 5006 based on the
Yeah, and that's, I think I stated that earlier. We would leverage what had already been done. We wouldn't try to validate that again.
But
basically.
what you use the numbers for on there
would basically be
in the closeout, you just simply move forward with the closeout.
Right, and it's just basically a comparison to what those line item grant amounts were, and either you're above it or below it, and we make the adjustment based off of that.
Further comments?
Sounds really simple.
Okay, map it out for me, Letty. You want to summarize?
Well, so if we, all right, so we discussed the performance audit. Performance audit is really something different. And I think we kind of concluded it's not the right vehicle because now we'd be adding a whole nother thing that we're doing where we're already doing expenditure audit with an audit process in place. And the part about it being uncontrolled by, the controller office doesn't review the Prop 39s. I think that is actually a significant piece of it. So we're kind of back to, Bill, what we were talking about before, the two things, OPSC and the fiscal auditors, and what's the dynamic between those two. So if, in fact, we put in an audit guide that is sufficient to give the ability for OPSC to rely then on the 5006 without retesting it, then that saves, so the district wouldn't be going through expenditure audit with OPSC. It would simply be, not simply, it would be a reconciliation of all of the closeout items with respect to adjustments, savings, all those odd bits that happen in the various components of the program. And I know you have projects that marry funding sources, or funding sources are embedded in other things, and that I am sure makes your closeouts more interesting.
So one of the things that we spent a bunch of time talking about last time was what triggers closeout, right? I mean, that's still, I mean, part of the reason I think we're here is that this process takes so long for many districts that getting to the point of closing the projects, and there's been issues that have come up. So we've got districts are going through an annual education audit. Their 5006 is being used. OPSC is assisting in preparing updates to the audit guide, working with controller and with your team and finance, and the process is going along. The job ends, and then so right at this end point, is there, because right now, Rick, remind me, what is the current regulatory environment right at the end?
So essentially, if you submit a 5006 and 100% report annotated on there, then that falls onto our workload list. The other thing that's kind of out there too is you have that 3-year, 4-year timeline. You have 3 years for an elementary school, 4 years for middle and high school, to submit your final report, which is supposed to be your 100% report. Once we get that, that falls onto our workload list, and then we've got 2 years to pick up that project, engage the district, and then once we engage, we have 6 months after that engagement date to complete the review. There are circumstances in which maybe we're asking for additional information and we're not able to get it within the 6 months where it extends out past the 6 months, but those are kind of few and far between.
And so, can you tell me what percentage of projects do you actually review the expenditures on when you get to the closeout phase? I mean, just a rough order of magnitude.
I think you can just kind of refer to the OSA report that came out in 2011.
So less than 10%?
It was less than 10%.
Okay. All right. No, I appreciate it. I'm just trying to understand the order of magnitude. So for many projects, you receive all the reports, you essentially take a look at it, see that there's nothing there that basically you must have some mechanism for reviewing. So if you get, for the 90% of the projects you don't review, what happens? I guess I'm asking that. What's your process internally?
Basically, we have to make a decision on whether there's going to be an adjustment that has to go to the board or it can be closed out administratively. That would be the two paths, basically.
Okay. Good. So how does so back to the panel here. If we have districts in the education audit and coming back into essentially when whatever the closeout trigger is, the final 5006, the external auditor does their last review, transmits that back to OPSC. They then go through whatever process, essentially the administrative closeout for the majority of the projects, or a reconciliation and then action back to the state allocation board. Does that, in simplest terms, does that make sense? Does that make sense to you? What else needs to happen from your standpoint?
If something had to be adjusted, we'd have to be notified and then be able to take it to the board on that. The other option is to close it out administratively, where you don't need board action.
It strikes me that part of what we're talking about too is that the auditors would perform their function, and what happens to the audits each year?
They're submitted to Controller's Office. Controller's Office reviews and certifies the reports as to whether they're in compliance with audit standards in the K-12 audit guide. If there are findings, depending on the nature of the finding, Department of Education, the County Office of Education, or the County Office of Education would follow up on certain findings. And so what I would envision is that we would be also informing OPSC that there are findings in certain audit reports, and we would turn those over to OPSC to follow up on however they see fit. And then if there are findings where there basically could be result in having to be repaid, it goes on the track of an appeal if the district chooses to appeal their findings.
And that's through the
Education Audit Appeal Panel.
Okay, so let's move a little further down the track. So you want to comment on that?
With this parallel track, then, if there's an appeal and it's already in this bottom parallel track with external audit, that's going to continue down the Education Audit Appeal Panel process. Is that what I'm hearing?
It could. It really depends on, are you asking for money back, or if the expenditure results, let's say there's a finding that they didn't comply with the Public Contracts Code, is the end result of that that the district has to repay? And that's where, when you're doing crafting the procedures in the audit guide, we need to know what the end result, if it's simply a compliance finding and it's being reported out, then, and there's no repayment requirement or transfer requirement of transferring funds, let's say, from the general fund to the Fund 35 to correct that expenditure or that noncompliance, then it simply becomes a compliance finding that the district is going to need to correct in the future. So it really, in order to to craft the audit procedures, and the end result, we need to know what's the requirement. Is it something that has to be repaid or not? So that's something that would have to be defined by OPSC, and obviously it should be in state law and regulation.
And I think this was an area that in one of our earliest meetings, I think we heard some concerns regarding sort of the role of the State Allocation Board. And since I work for the board, I think we need to make sure that we understand the OPSC's responsibility to the board, and then the board's, the board oversees all of these funds and allocates all the funds. How do they get involved in the Education Audit Appeals Panel process, if that is a route that all of these go in, and is that the way we want to do it? So anyway,
Right, and I think that there obviously is going to have to probably be some type of legislation that defines some of this. I don't know if there could be legislation that says if it's a finding related to school facilities, then all those findings go to State Allocation Board. Could it be something as simple as routing any findings like that to State Allocation Board, so the Education Audit Appeal Panel doesn't get involved? So there are things that. There's a lot that needs to be thought through and talked through. But first and foremost is that noncompliance going to result in repayment? Because if it's not, then, why appeal a finding that there's no dollar impact for? And so I think first and foremost you have to decide. That has to be defined.
And so I think it really depends on what the State Allocation Board's role is, because right now, there are certain findings that would go back to the State Board of Education rather than EAP for like charter school funding determinations. If we have an audit finding for that, the State Board is the one that set that rate in the first place, so those findings go back to SBE to make a determination and not EAP. But
so you're saying that if
so
this program is what's being audited, we could have a similar mechanism where instead of going to the State Board of Education, it could come back to the State Allocation Board?
It depends, I think, what the role is of the State Allocation Board in the first place and the type of finding. So
they are the funding entity.
Yes,
and they
right.
do set the program.
Yeah. So I think it just depends on what it is that we're going to end up auditing for, and
the nature of the finding.
The nature of the finding, because we do have one case where the State Board makes the determination on the finding rather than EAP. But generally, it's EAP, right? Generally, the EAP panel is the one that they appeal to for return of state funds.
But it's not unprecedented, so that's good in that it might give us a mechanism to study as far as would that work for this. Because I know that is a concern of the State Allocation Board. This is their program, and they need it to route back to them.
And I'm not really clear, what type of findings do you think would come out of these audits? I mean, is it just expenditures, whether or not an expenditure
that we've
is
had repeated problems with is if people don't comply with doing competitive bidding process, particularly for architect.
Right.
But would that result in a return of state funds?
Well, it could very well be, because the premise by which you signed the contract was that you were going to follow those public contract code requirements, and if you didn't, you essentially violated that, and we could almost see that as an incorrect or illegal contract.
Yeah, there are a few points in the program that are almost pass-fail type questions where you didn't deserve the funding. One of the other elements, and this is one we've had a lot of really long board meetings about, is if you said you certified something that eventually was true but wasn't true when you certified it, then you got your money earlier and you jumped in line ahead of districts that should have been funded, and you received that. So districts not only have to pay back, they have to pay back the interest for the extra time they had the money. Is that, I mean, it's oversimplifying it,
right?
Because those were really long meetings.
The funding advantage, the time period in which you received the money, in which you shouldn't have. Yes.
Let's see, but that wouldn't be borne out in the 5006 audit. So that wouldn't be something
that would be found in 5005.
Right. So we're talking about only those items that would deal with the auditing the expenditure, the 5006.
And we really looked at the issues that the were coming up in the material inaccuracies. And that was the whole impetus to the 12-month, now 18-month check, was that we think those are predominantly items that will be caught by that review. They're not expenditure item review things by and large. Not that someone couldn't totally do expenditure wrong, but
let me take that one step further. In the chart, we are saying at the time of fund release, which is way up the timeline, that we are looking at those hot button issues.
And those are the really critical.
Right. So we're not waiting for 12 months or 18 months for those two, because that's where the bulk of the material inaccuracies were coming out of.
Because part of the issue was that districts go on and continue to do that practice incorrectly, and just whop up that bill bigger and bigger. And some of those things get harder and harder to vet out the farther you are from the timeline. People are no longer there. Paperwork's no longer accessible. So I think we kind of, okay, recap?
Sure. Well, there is actually one area on the chart that I'd like to have. Do you want to recap before we go on to another topic?
No, keep going.
Okay. I'd like to have Mr. Asbell talk a little bit about the green box that's over on the right side at the top, state agency full scope audit. Could you, this is something that's new on the chart, so can you
so this is actually this is something that's already in place as it relates to the state allocation board. They can require an audit of a project essentially. So there is that statutory framework in there right now. So we just put that out there just in case, the people had kind of forgot about that. If the SAB asked for that, then we would have to comply, or somebody would have to comply basically and follow through on that.
That would be like an extraordinary case, or
I would assume so. I mean, that would be up to the board.
And everybody's worried about that district's program, and
yeah, I mean, it could be a number of things, and that would be under the board's purview. They have that authority to do that. The other thing that we kind of threw in there too, if you're having this parallel track with the Education Audit Appeals Panel, I guess you can kind of make the assumption too that maybe that could be coming from the Education Audit Appeals Panel too.
I would say no.
You would say no?
The Education Audit Appeals is really more judicial, not calling for an audit of something. They would hear the appeals. So I don't think they would be an entity to request that an audit be done.
So what do you mean by what it says is state agency full scope audit? What does that mean?
Well, essentially, when we talk about full scope audit, and that would have to be kind of blushed out, but at the direction of the board, you would have, I'm just going to throw out just SCO maybe, or maybe OPSC is asked to take a look at a project. They would kind of define the scope for us and tell us what to look at, and then we would base our examination based on that direction.
Cassandra, is there comparable, do you perform things like, let's say that you are referred to a school district as that you have evidence of fraud, of something that needs to be investigated. Do you do stuff like this now?
We can. There's a provision in the education code that allows us to build upon the annual audits. So if we find significant issue with a specific school district and we want to explore that further, we can go out and actually perform build-upon work. And what we do is we would look at, review the independent auditor's report as well as their working papers, so that we would try not to duplicate any the audit. And it is actually it's not a cost of the district; it's a cost of the controller's office or to the state if we chose to do that. So, and that mechanism is, we don't use it very often, given the limited resources, but we can.
There's also a provision that allows county superintendents of schools to call for an audit based on fraud, misappropriation of funds, or something else. I can't remember.
That would be our department. That would be for FCMAT.
That's right. And then oftentimes the county would contact FCMAT to do those types of audits.
Right.
Sometimes it involves money, and sometimes it's just compliance, right?
So all those mechanisms would still be in place in everything we're talking about.
That, yes.
Yeah, and I just wanted everybody to not lose sight of the fact that there is always kind of been that authority out there. So I just put it out there.
Hopefully rarely needed.
Yeah, okay. So Good. I just want to make sure we went down that. I'd like to ask if there's anyone in the audience that would like to make a comment or ask a question. Okay, hearing none. So, Letty, do you want to?
I guess we got all the commenting people on the committee. Closeout. So we discussed closeout trigger, which is basically at the 100% 5006 or the timeline end dates, whichever comes first.
Right, but to expand on that 3-year or 4-year, the district is supposed to give us the final report at that 3-year or 4-year. So it's supposed to be the 100% report.
And if you go to the chart in this middle section, the second blue vertical rectangle, you're proposing here in this chart that the final review would start within 1 year rather than within 2 years. Isn't that what the current regulation is?
Right. So we'd have to have a regulatory change, and in the spirit of closing down the life cycle of a project, that's what we're advocating. We can cut a year off at that point.
Now, which box cuts that year off? This one?
No, to your left. Go to your left. It's the second.
Oh, okay. I see it now. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would it be a requirement to change the regs when you could just implement the review at 1 year instead of cutting it down? Then we wouldn't have to change the regs. So you have up to 2 years, but by practice you would do it within that first year.
I think from an operational standpoint, we probably administratively could do that, but I think we'd feel a lot more comfortable having it in regulation. That way everybody knows what the rules are.
Yeah, I think we're going to end up with the need for some regulatory changes related to this process anyway, so we might as well try and wrap it up and make it very clean and clear for OPSC and for districts and everyone involved. So this could be part of that.
Was the 2 years a basis of workload, that it would take that long to get to them? Or what's the basis of the 2 years? Maybe that would help me understand it.
I don't know what the genesis of the 2 years, that's before my time.
Trying to remember.
That's a good one, Rick.
Because right now, as we receive closeouts for districts, it looks like they're about 2 years behind from when they submitted their final closeout. And so I'm just wondering if bumping it up to a year gives how that affects OPSC's workload and being able to meet that time frame.
But there's a whole bunch of the workload they have now that shifts elsewhere. So,
well, we have a huge workload right now.
I know.
So, that kind of points to what the OSA report had talked about, and us being able to look at certain projects, the volume of projects. So, it's difficult. It does require us to shuffle around a little bit, but as it stands right now, we're still kind of trying to hold to that 2 year. If we can get things out sooner than that, that's what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Patty?
Okay. I was just reading the blue boxes again to see if we
Missed any blue boxes?
Uh-huh.
Can we take a minute and talk about, we did talk about this a little bit before. Are there, in terms of preparing updated recommendations back to the audit subcommittee, are there any issues that we really need to focus on or iron out in terms of implementing the use of the external audits of the annual education audit? I think we talked about some of the timing issues related to fiscal year stuff. There's that one that's hanging out there. Are there statutory changes that are required to do this? Can somebody to use the annual education audit?
Well, I don't think so, other than the change in terms of if you want the appeals to go through the SAB, or I can think of that. But in terms of proposing the audit portion of it, you'll need to, OPSC would need to determine, whatever the compliance requirements are based on your current regulations. And then you would bring those to the K-12 Audit Guide Committee, and then the Audit Guide Committee would meet and discuss it. The earliest that this would probably go in to the Audit Guide would be 14, 15.
Mm-hmm.
is what I think.
Yeah, I think that was what we talked about last
Right.
time.
I don't think there's any statutory change other than that.
No.
Yeah.
So the audit guide itself is in the California Code of Regulations, right?
Right, that's correct.
And so each year, do you add a new section to the regulation, essentially, by the adoption of the guide?
We do, but we modify it, so if there's no changes to the audit guide, which I can't think of any time there hasn't been, you would add a new section to the audit guide.
Okay. And that's a yearly exercise, essentially?
It's a yearly exercise.
With the audit committee process that you described a little bit last time.
Right, and we would ask OPSC to come to the audit guide committee and other, whoever else is interested. Interested parties, right.
Wouldn't that begin in January? This coming January, wouldn't we have to have something, going at that point? Isn't that where it starts?
Actually, we
For
usually,
that other time period?
we start meeting in September.
Okay.
And start ironing out, discussing the items that would be added to the guide and narrowing those down or changes to the audit guide. And then by January, we try to have the proposals to the Education Audit Appeal Panel. They will convert those into legalese or regulation language, and so we review that to make sure the meeting hasn't changed and the procedures or the steps are understandable, and then they're the ones, the Education Audit Appeal Panel actually pushes it through the administrative law process, not the controller's office.
So backing up the timeline to the first implementation period would be what year, what fiscal year?
14-15.
14-15. In order to do that, then backing that up, we would probably need to have something from OPSC to the committee by this September.
No, it would be September of 2013.
Okay.
Right,
okay.
but it would be nice to be ahead of the game.
Okay.
To start sooner rather than later.
Well, because it's probably going to take some iterations to get
Correct.
there.
Right.
So,
Well, and I would
thank you for
imagine there'd
assuming we
be,
weren't going to do that in 3 weeks.
I'm imagining that OPSC and Mr. Morales and his staff especially would be busy with whatever we needed to do in terms of regulatory changes
Right.
on our side of the house to implement this. So there's probably a two-step process if we were to go down this road. When I heard Shiloh say that the auditors were going to pay for all of this by not increasing their fees, you want to? I know that was tongue in cheek. I apologize. But could you talk about costs just for a minute? If in consideration of the kind of level of scope that we've been talking about here, what do we see as the cost impacts? Just I guess opinions about it.
It's really going to depend on the procedures, the amount of time involved, and then you would look at it at least from our perspective. So if the procedures are, if there's 1 or 2 procedures or 10 procedures, I mean, the number of hours that are going to be involved is really going to dictate the cost. It's really tough to estimate what that is, but I mean, just from hearing what I think would happen, I can't envision this being a cost of a Proposition 39 audit. I mean, you would be talking a matter of you probably using a staff or senior accountant who would be able to do most of this work within a 2-3 day timeline, maybe more, depending on the size of the district, depending on the number of projects, the number of expenditures. Dollar-wise, it'd be hard to estimate, but I honestly don't anticipate it being a significant additional cost.
And part of, I think, the reason that that's so different from our experience with OPSC is that they're already having us pull things. They're already in the district. They're already there. So the infrastructure of doing it is in place, where when OPSC comes in and we start with a whole different audit, it's a whole nother set of gear up to pull things, send stuff. So I think while there's a cost to the district, there's a tremendous efficiency to having it embedded in a known and well-vetted process.
I think there are some offsets, certainly, because you're not duplicating some of that work, so you have some time savings in your staffing, some time savings at the district level that you would otherwise be pulling documents or maybe even bringing extra time in or overtime or things like that that would probably offset these costs. But you're absolutely correct. It's almost impossible to put a dollar amount on it because you don't know what the thresholds are, number one. Number two, you could have a district that has multiple projects that are, some large, some small, some medium. It just would really depend, and it's really going to kind of come down to the thresholds and the procedures and the number of procedures that have to be tested and verified by the audit team in comparison to the size of the project. That's really going to be ultimately how you're going to figure out how much it's going to cost. But I think there's already some costs and some, advantages by this to the districts. I mean, not having to go through this, this double process all the time and back and forth and making copies and, all that, getting it ready for OPSC and sending it and all that. There are some cost advantages to making some of these changes for districts.
One of the things we do also when we're assigning our reviews to our auditors is we try to batch projects for a district. Now, that all kind of ties into when the 5006 is submitted, but that's another thing that you can look at, too, is some kind of batch processing.
Yeah, good point.
Bill, I'd suggest that, and maybe tongue-in-cheek, that there would be some administrative savings to the program because we're shifting audit scope, and here's the really tongue-in-cheek part, that could be passed on to projects in the form of a supplemental grant.
That's a good thought, Jeff.
It's great to have you on the committee.
The one thing I will say, because with Proposition 39 being required, the audit, I believe, can be paid for with that as well. I mean, since you have to have an audit, those monies can pay for that. So, I look at that as being, if the audit becomes required, it becomes part of EAP, is there a way that that program can then pay for its audit?
As long as you're accomplishing the goals of the Prop 39 regulation, I think that it would be fine.
Well, and I'm talking about, can that translate to an OPSC funded project? So could that become a cost of the OPSC project?
If it's a requirement
An
of the
authorized
program.
cost?
So the audit cost is allowable expenditure, is that what you're
Yes,
asking?
exactly.
That's a good thought.
Rick, you don't have to weigh in right now. Well, yeah, and I think it's an interesting point because in the district that I was at, the Prop 39 audit was paid for from the bond funds.
Right.
Right, and that was your point, right? Okay. And so, anyway, yes, so interesting point. So, but a district now, for the annual education audit that they do, the district pays for that out of their general fund, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Is there, go ahead.
Can't they use federal funds too to pay for the A133 portion?
Right, they
Depends
It could
what
be
they
split,
have.
yeah.
So you could, the district's bond funds could be used to pay for a portion of the education audit if it included their projects, a review of their projects. And, well, anyway, so something to think about, because I think we are going to, the reason I brought up the cost is that it's going to become an issue, and we're going to need to understand what the impacts are and how that can be handled. So.
This is not a great time to put any impact on the general fund.
On the general fund, exactly. Okay.
Not that it ever is, but.
Can you talk a minute, Cassandra or Arlene, about how audits, the education audits are published or posted or their availability?
In terms of for the public, the districts should all be posting their audits, their annual audits, on their own websites.
Oh, that's right.
We do have, the controllers does have all of them, but we don't post them. So we don't post them on their website.
That's
And are they're posted with comments and responses?
The complete audit should be posted by the district.
So you have all the audits, but you currently don't post them or make them public in any way?
No, we don't.
Okay.
But they are all required to be public.
Yes, they
Correct?
are public
Yes.
documents.
Okay, good. Let's see. So does anyone else, are there any comments from the audience? I don't see any. Any other comments on what we've discussed today?
This is good process, and to the extent we kind of arrive at where we are on the regular projects, I again want to say this whole thing has to be started from scratch and rediscussed with respect to financial hardship because their calendars are different, the assumptions of granting are different. We want to make sure that we're making a process that also is efficient for financial hardship districts. Just also a comment that I got since last meeting was to be sure that in any review or work on the manuals or the guides, the handbook, whatever we end up calling the documents that come out of this, a great level of clarity as to when we're talking about financial hardship. Because I know even in the documents we had last time at committee, it was kind of interwoven when we were talking about financial hardship and when we weren't. Mm-hmm. And different rules apply. So I think that needs to be addressed by the committee before I think we're ready to give something to the State Allocation Board Committee. I don't know how to take it on because other than those who have been involved in it, you kind of don't know the
I would
nuances of the rules.
propose, Letty, as a starting point for that discussion, that the conceptual process that we discussed here works for financial hardship as well as discussed. That expenditures are reviewed for program compliance, that OPSC conducts a reconciliation at the end of the project, and adjustments are made at the allocation board works for hardship as well.
Okay. So then you have this whole layer of calendar that other people don't have to maintain your financial hardship status. Does that work in conjunction with this? Does that get harder or easier?
Process for financial hardship.
To stay in financial hardship?
Yeah, I'm looking at that as a completely separate issue as far as how you qualify for financial hardship from the auditing of a specific project.
So that doesn't get complicated by the 18-month point and the other point?
No, it's completely different.
So it's really in respect to how the manuals are written and when we're talking about rules that apply to financial hardship and rules that apply to regular program items, that's really where we need to pay attention to that. Because that comment came back to me, be sure that we're not assuming everything works the same for financial hardship.
But I don't think that would affect how the expenditures are audited.
The expenditure component.
So the timing of when you establish your eligibility from financial hardship, that's going to be completely outside of the realm. I think the only thing that really comes into play is the savings component is treated differently. But beyond that, I don't see that there should be much divergence from.
And if we come back to that at the point of the trigger, when it goes back to OPSC for closeout analysis, financial hardship has a more stringent financial analysis. Closeout analysis.
Well, it's spelled out in regulation, though. It's pretty descriptive, so I don't think there's any ambiguity.
Okay.
And,
all right.
And OPSC is doing that piece, not the external auditor. Is that correct?
Rewriting the guides.
We'll work with whoever we need to work with to get it done.
Yeah.
You're talking about the program guide?
Yeah. I'm kind of going back to the program guide in that.
Oh, you're talking about the blue track as opposed to the pink track?
Yeah. Okay, so you're going to have an audit guide that really functions as an audit guide. To have a good audit guide, you actually have to have a good program manual.
Well, so let me make sure I understand. My understanding is that the audit guide would be developed as a part of the regular audit guide development for the annual education audit, the input and...
Yeah, wait a minute, let me back up.
Okay, good. You were confusing me.
Okay, there are really three things. So you have a program manual, So you know, so we can read what the different components of the program are, which components of the program apply to each project, what are we applying for, so that we understand the 5004 and the 5005. All those things are in a manual or handbook, correct? There's also a companion to that, and this, one of the committee's strong points, I think, last time was that those need to be written in a way they're easy to use. They have checklists. We know what project, what program we're talking about when we're reading a paragraph, and that the audit, what used to be called the audit, OPSC audit guide, was a companion in the sense that it was complementary to that, so that they had the same similar layout, that they were able to, we were able to follow them, and we would have checklists for when we were in compliance. You know, here's the things you're going to need to do. There has to be something the districts are following. It goes back to that effort of, I can't get an A if you don't tell me what an A looks like. Don't give me a D if I don't know how to get an A. So the district needs to know what they need to compile, what they need to track, what documents need to be available, those kinds of things. That's different than the criteria that go to the auditor to say, here are the protocols we want you to audit.
So I think we did throw out a draft to you 2 meetings ago or 3 meetings ago. So I don't know if we can use that as a springboard for further discussion.
And we need to go back to that, I think.
Yeah. Cassandra, did you have a comment?
So I think there should only be one audit guide, and it would be the K-12 audit guide. There shouldn't be another audit guide. The program manual should incorporate everything that you ever wanted to know about, you know, the program.
So what we used to have as 2 documents, you're seeing get compiled into one comprehensive document.
One comprehensive document, and then you've got this audit guide that's separate, that goes to the Education Audit Appeals Panel. And those procedures that are in that audit guide, you've got information, explanations, whatever, in your program manual.
Makes
so
sense.
This should just be, you don't want to have several audit guides, and it's going to confuse, I think, everyone.
So what I'm still not clear about, if the annual audit is going to just test internal controls and expenditures, would there be a finding where a district would be required to return funds to the state?
Say that again.
In the annual audit guide, we're going to be testing expenditures to see if it was an appropriate expenditure to charge, right, to the project. Would there be an instance where an auditor would have a finding that would require the district to return money to the state?
Yes.
And in what, how would that happen?
If you had a financial hardship project that expended funds for a non-allowable expense and the project is closed, then that expenditure might result in a reimbursement to the state.
Okay, and that's just for the
There's a whole slew of complicated rules about 3 years.
Just in a nutshell, if you have financial hardship and you have residual or savings, that amount either has to be returned to the state or applied to a new future financial hardship project within 3 years. How you determine the savings is you have to find the eligible expenditures and compare that to the ground amount. So if you have less eligible expenditures due to something that's ineligible, your residual amount of savings increases, therefore that would have to come back to the state. Does that make sense?
Okay, and the expectation is that the external auditor would be looking at that?
Well, if they're looking at the appropriateness of the expenditure, which reduces the eligible expenditures, then that would affect the bottom line, yeah.
Yeah, it could.
But I would imagine that the auditor would report just the amount of the ineligible expenditure and then the calculation of
the reconciliation at the end.
It would just be like, this is our question cost, or this is our ineligible expenditure amount. And I would go back to, if there are a lot of these finite rules that are embedded within each different type of program, and then those need to really be spelled out in the procedures for the auditor. Otherwise, you can have an ineffective audit. An auditor may not catch those things if they don't understand all of those criteria. So, there's going to be a lot of work involved in in developing those procedures so that OPSC gets what they want out of the auditors.
So let me muddle the waters a little bit more here.
Perfect. That's
Site acquisition. Let's say you have a non-financial hardship project, but you have site acquisition, and through the examination, you find that some of the expenditures were not allowable. Well, we have to, or the SAB has to adjust the amount based on what we gave you and what the eligible expenditures also were. So it can actually get into non-financial hardship also.
And I think we
That's
talked
true.
about-
I was just giving.
Didn't we
Yeah,
talk
I'm just
about a
trying to-
comparable process for another program, the charter school program?
right. So that would be an instance where that audit finding would go back to SAB because SAB has the authority to adjust the project amount, correct?
I believe so, yes.
I think that's an
So,
area
yeah.
that we really need to focus on and get some clarity in terms of the concept for how this will work and model it on the other program that you talked about.
I just wanted to go back. I know you, Letty, you're refreshing my memory because back when we were meeting last year, there was this whole concept of the manual and the audit guide. And the K-12 audit guide proposal that we're making is talking specifically about expenditures. I do believe that there should be one audit guide for that purpose. And I don't believe that OPSC would have a separate audit guide that would include any expenditure testing. But what will districts use to help them determine compliance as it relates to the other elements of the audit that OPSC does? So if we're saying that you'll have the program manual, but we're eliminating we would eliminate their audit guide, or what would that look like? Because districts are going to need guidance to know what to do with the elements of the, I guess, program audit that they would be getting from OPSC, because it really is two pieces to this.
Right, and I was just thinking that you have the program manual that would incorporate whatever that is. And then you have the K-12 audit guide, because if you have multiple audit guides, there's going to be a lot of confusion.
Yeah, and I get the semantics
Right.
issue that you end up with, but I think what we just need to be really clear that we need very clearly laid out expectations for districts in the program. And if we can if we do really well at the manual part of this, at the expectation part of this, we eliminate a whole bunch of the audit problem part of this. So by and large, school districts prefer to do a good job and not have complications. So if we give them good front-end materials, I think, and good processes they can follow, we will have better outcomes. That's the whole point.
Right, and I think the Department of Education actually does a really good job in, with some of their programs, laying out the expectations, and then you take those expectations and you model your audit procedures based on that. So, and they have, they put out frequently asked questions, they update it. So, they've got some good, they have a good process.
Well, and I think part of the program guide side of the house is going to have to be really robust, because it's not only going to have the program review components in it, but also an understanding of the process we're talking about today, or of how the auditing occurs and what happens, and so there's a lot of work to do in this area. And so the key things I heard was only one audit guide, right? But making
Call
sure
everything else something else.
call everything else that we need to explain something else. But I think that that's going to be an important part of going forward. I totally agree. And so, and Andrea did remind me, she has her copy here of the draft that the OPSC brought to one of our last meetings, and that there are still some comments we want to do on that. It strikes me that we may need to rethink how that's laid out, but I mean, anyway, given where we are, but anyway. So, okay, what's the pleasure of the group? We're almost at the witching hour.
I just want to make sure I understand, from what I gathered, the financial hardship from the audit perspective and testing the expenditures, it's not any different. So that's okay. So kind of the process is...
Right. The issue for the financial hardships is the final reconciliation.
And that'll be performed by OPSC.
Right.
They'll use whatever the results of the audits are. If they're ineligible expenditures that are reported by the external auditors, you'll use that as a basis for making whatever adjustments that you're going to make. Okay.
Okay, so a couple of things before we break. There were a whole series of original recommendations that the group made, 2 years ago, that went to the board. How do we want to start thinking about rewriting, totally starting over? Is there a subset of members with a lot of time on their hands? No, I'm only kidding. We need to start thinking about how to get to a point of preparing updated recommendations. And the second thing is that I'm a little concerned. I mean, there's probably two ways to handle this, and we've talked about it internally differently too. But this is a pretty big change. I mean, it's not actually that different. I think it's more fleshed out and than the original recommendations. The original recommendations of the group basically said external entity, but I don't think it was quite as well fleshed out as we've gotten it to. I'm not trying to say, but I think this is a much better sense that we've gotten into some more detail. We've looked at a lot of different things. I'm a little concerned that I want to make sure that the members of the audit subcommittee from the State Allocation Board, the legislative and administrative members, get a chance to see this and potentially comment on our direction before we finalize it, even although the flip side of that is we keep working, come up with the final recommendations that this working group has, take them to the audit subcommittee. So
I do think it's good to check in with the audit subcommittee for direction. Otherwise, we might end up with way more meetings than we had anticipated. If they're not comfortable with it, we got to redirect. So, but I also see two primary areas where work needs to be done that might not necessarily need to involve the committee until those groups have done a substantial amount and then come to this committee. One is to look at the statutory elements, what needs to be done for statutory changes, what needs to happen in the way of, board legislation. And I think the board will be very interested in that. And then I think there needs to be a writing review group as OPSC works through the manual guide criteria, that there's a writing review process that perhaps an iteration of that could happen before it comes back to full committee. I'm just being sensitive to how hard it is to get this group together. Sure. And how much time commitment is represented on this panel. So if those could kind of be two groups that work so that OPSC is not necessarily working in isolation, particularly on the writing, but it's really kind of being iteratively tested with some district and county folks, I think that might be very productive. Just an idea, open to other suggestions, but that would indicate it'd be a little bit longer timeline before we'd come back together for that
purpose. Well, let me toss one thing out. So I talked with Senator Lowenthal's office. He's the chair of the subcommittee, and there is an opportunity that he would have potentially on August 27th to convene a meeting, assuming we could get the rest of the members. I actually think it might be important to go back and at least have a conceptual discussion about where we are in that setting, but I'm open for input from anybody in the audience or on the working group. I want to make sure that we have a consensus and that the members of the subcommittee are aware of where we're going so that they can feel comfortable with it. So, but I would take feedback from anybody.
Is that a meeting
here too.
Of the SAB or the subcommittee?
Of the subcommittee.
On the 27th?
In the morning, so we would potentially take the feedback we received from this meeting, update the process flow chart, frame an outline, if you will, of what the recommendations might be, and present it to them.
Yeah.
all of us or whatever subset, Mr. Asbell, myself, and you guys, and get some feedback and make sure we weren't too far out ahead. Ms. Garrity?
Yeah. Hi, Mayvon Garrity with Senator Lowenthal's office. I didn't hear that you had said the 27th. You said that?
No, I thought that was what you...
No. I didn't. So I wanted to make sure that folks were aware that we were looking at that date.
Right, that's what I just brought up.
You said it? Okay, I'm sorry. I was
So,
in the ozone.
as far as coming back with a conceptual conversation rather than formal proposal, but here's where we've gotten as a subcommittee. These are the next steps we're looking at. That kind of touch base would be helpful to the subcommittee, or does it need to be more formal than that?
Well, I think I frankly would like it to be more formal. I think you're pretty far along with, and I think so much of what I'm hearing is consistent with what the board already adopted.
Right.
So to get that, and it's gone, as Bill said, it's gone further. It's gone into, there were some more general concepts, and you've kind of narrowed some of that. So if it's possible, I think to come back and say where you are consistently supporting the board's actions, and then here's some detail that we see and we'd like to continue pursuing, and do you agree with that more defined direction?
So if we took, just an idea, Bill, if we took the previous recommendations and we looked at those that we can basically check off, these things are happening, and then these we've rediscussed and here's where we are on them, but use the same general framework, or is that framework toast and we just got to start over?
I don't know. I have to think about it.
There
But
are
yeah,
parts
that's
of it
partly
that
what I
flow
wanted
better
us
than
to. That's really what I want us to start thinking about, because I'm just trying to get us to closure and have consensus.
And I keep kind of going back to, it's not just recommendations, it's board adopted policies
Right.
at this
No,
point.
it's a good
So I wouldn't say that
You're right.
framework is toast, because it is board
Yeah.
adopted policy.
Okay, point well taken.
Good point.
And I guess part of where something that's weighing on me is that Senator Lowenthal is coming to the end of his term, and I'm anxious to have him, be involved in this important work that you've been doing. Also, I just want to make this point that I think a critical part of what the board adopted was your recommendation to have a body like yourself be involved in the development of the audit guidebook. And I know that's coming up, that's part of the discussion, and yet I'm still hearing it like it's, gee, that would be nice. That was part of what the board adopted. So if the will of this group is that be formed, if you want to give, in fact, I think this particular group would be wonderful to be doing that, not to volunteer all of you for more work, but I just kind of want to push along that you've got support from the board to do these things. So, a discussion about if you continue to think that's appropriate, a discussion about how to go forward with that would be
Well, from other
welcome.
writing groups. Oh, sorry.
Why don't we let
Okay.
Deanna, do you want to?
Come back to writing.
Deanna Glick from Joan Buchanan's office. I just wanted to second the notion that I think it's a good idea to come back to the audit subcommittee sooner rather than later, just because you have taken a turn, and I have been attending the working group meetings. I go back to Joan consistently and report, but I want to make sure that where you're going is clearly conveyed to her, because I don't have the background to be able to really get into the details and into the weeds on some of these issues. So I think for the conceptual direction you're taking, it would be great to come back to the subcom as soon as possible.
I agree.
So,
With respect to writing, because it's such an extensive, just truly a rethinking of how we're communicating the program in that program manual, is that what it is? I think it'd be good to talk about structure, good, clear communication. Clarity comes from good structure in this kind of thing, and to talk about structure and agree on a tentative structure of the material, and then begin to put OPSC really should have the burden of the writing, but I think that might be a two-step process, and I don't know if that's full committee work or if the full committee would like to designate that to a few just really for time's sake, because we need to get something out there. Just thoughts?
Memory is coming back as certain things are said, because we have been doing this for quite some time. As I recall, along the lines of the guideline or the audit manual or whatever we were calling it, we wanted to be, at one time, we wanted to be very specific about which programs required certain things.
Yeah.
Almost to the point where, the neophytes out there that are just now coming up through the rank and file could open up a book and say, I've got a career tech project, and right away I'm going to have to submit a blank and a blank and a blank, and oh, by the way, in Appendix A, here's what the form looks like. Didn't we have that?
Yes.
Okay, so
there was a discussion like that, yes.
I would hope that we could incorporate that to some degree, and it may make something really big or onerous, but that to me would be the easiest way to make sure that anybody who sits down, again, I'm thinking of the new people who are coming up and in theory learning how to do all this, don't miss a step. If the program guide or the manual or whatever we want to call it is, and I don't want to use the words dumbed down, but it's very, very self-explanatory and it leads you through what you have to fill out for your career tech project or for your joint use project or and the time frames. This is due within 18 months. This is due within 1 year. And I think that might be a bit of a large task, but if we could get close to that, that would be awesome.
Okay, go ahead.
I think in our previous draft, though, we did break it out by program, if I remember right. We had a heading that had the program,
Right,
and then on the left-hand side we had,
We do have something we can use to respond to as a launch into that conversation.
Thank you.
Is it a pleasure of the panel kind of that we target to do that as a group? Is that what I'm hearing, that we all want to review that and participate in that? You okay with that? It's more time? Okay. All right.
Okay, so it's time to wrap it up, and I'll work with Senator Lowenthal's office and with OPSC staff regarding setting up a meeting of the audit subcommittee to review our progress. And I want to thank everybody again so much for coming up to Sacramento and participating in the discussion. I think it was really fruitful, and we really value your work and your participation. Thank you so much.